Hi everyone and welcome to the Ultimate Physique Podcast. I'm your host Carl Raggio and today we're talking with Dr. Tony Boutagy, one of Australia's leading coaches and educators with over 30 years experience in the fitness industry. Tony has worked with countless Olympic athletes, professional athletes and other sports people, which has seen him write a staggering 70,000 training programs across his career. Now, if there's one thing we can be sure of, it's that Tony knows a thing or two about program design. So in today's episode, we're going to discuss all things program design, periodization for personal trainers and other coaches in order to maximize their client results. Now, if you get any value at all from today's episode, it would mean the world to me if you leave me a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Now, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. All right, so I have the pleasure of being joined today by Dr. Tony Boutagy. So, Tony, if someone's been living under a rock for the last 10 to 15 years, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are in a nutshell?
Great. Thanks for having me today. I am essentially a strength and conditioning coach who wears a few hats in the industry. I started as a coach and a personal trainer and moved into education. So I'm now almost 50-50 in teaching, educating, and personal training coaching. And the coaching has spanned a number of different goals, athletic attributes, and I think at last count, I'd worked with people in over 30 different sports or thereabouts.
Wow.
But my day-to-day work is working with the general public using methods that I've used in strength and conditioning with the general public. So it brings me great joy to have a foot in both camps of teaching, educating, and at the cold face of working with real people hands-on.
Yeah, unreal. And I guess just for context, like for anyone listening as well, I've been involved in the fitness industry since 2013, and I believe you were one of my most influential and probably one of my first mentors or educators in that space. So it's really cool to be able to have this conversation and, to continue this on 10, 11 years later, which is awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And I guess I wanted to bring up, because this was an interesting point, and I actually saw this on your website. So I wanted to dive into a little bit of detail in this, first of all. But Olympic athletes, firstly, and I guess the depth and breadth of your programming history. So from what I could see, it was apparently 70,000 training programs approximately that you've written over the course of your training career.
It's not something that I sit at home and count, but I was at a Meetings of the Mind conference, now maybe going back 5-6 years.
Yeah.
And as part of that, we had to talk about our history and our experience. So I started to add up as part of that talk, who I'd worked with and how many programs that I had written over the years. And at that point, it was about 70,000. And it seems like a lot, but 30 years working 40 to 50 hours a week, and also doing a lot of online programming where I would have a day where I'd just sit and write program after program. So I don't write generic programs. I write programs for individuals. And that probably, there's people who've trained more people, but that's one program that trains hundreds, if not thousands of people. But I've not done that. I just have your goals, your testing, and I write one program for one person.
Yeah. And I guess, for anyone who's watching the video, you will see the hundreds, if not thousands of books behind Tony. And I suppose from my understanding of you, certainly being one of the most educated and well-read personal trainers, we'll call you that, with a PhD. So I guess in your experience, it's like, hey, the things that you're doing are really based on like your understanding and logic that you've gained in, your 30 years experience coaching and learning.
It's always this combination of reading science, reading what other good coaches are doing,
Yep.
talking with other coaches, but also this experience of really what does work. If you're training a beginner, an intermediate, somebody who's well-trained, someone who's gifted, somebody who is not. And that's what you can't get from books. And you can always tell some of my friends, we've gone through uni together and they're doing the scientifically based program and it's all accurate. It's all based on latest research, but it just lacks that finesse that comes from when I talk to other coaches who've been, one of my good friends, he's been coaching for 40 years. I was listening to a lecture from Vern Gambetta, who's been coaching for 55 years. So me at 30, I'm halfway to what these guys are doing. And they have such art in looking at a body and knowing just what it needs.
Yeah.
And this is across disciplines, whether it's a chef or a lawyer, they're experienced because they've done it for so long. I'm always trying to learn from those people who've been ahead of me in the game.
Yeah, and I think this is an important thing to bring up, especially in the period that we're in now, where like evidence-based coaching is like the cool thing, um, which, like you said, from a practical standpoint, makes sense. You want to be up to date with the research and understand what's happening at a fundamental level, but without the coaching experience and the in the trenches kind of knowledge to be able to mesh those two paradigms together is really important. And I think you're one of those people that's really nailed that.
Well, thank you. It's always looking at what the research is saying, but a lot of my coaches, and this isn't controversial, would say, well, we trial and we test with our group of athletes and we come up with ideas that then later research, once they've got ethics and enough population, can see if that's actually true or not. And we need that data because when you see trends in the fitness industry from this is the new exercise or your glutes should do 40 sets per workout 3 times a week, that's where we say, does that reconcile with what we know about muscle metabolism and muscle hypertrophy? Is that, have we missed something or are you really onto? And this is why you must always be grabbing what the data and what we know about science is saying, combined with what coaching has historically done and what we've done in our own practice.
And I think that's a really important point for other personal trainers and coaches out there to kind of understand that, hey, just because like a new paper comes out that says this outlandish thing doesn't mean you kind of need to throw out your whole process that you have for program design around that particular topic. It's like, understand what's useful, how does that apply, and then you can kind of make small changes to your overall approach, as more research comes to light.
I think that's the important point is that as coaches and trainers, we need to have a system and a plan. And if new data comes out, and new data comes out every day,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean suddenly we just add that to our client's program without respect to, well, where are they going? Where have they been? And it doesn't matter whether it's a new study that says foot position on a leg curl makes no difference, or training the hamstrings in a lengthened range is better than a shortened range. And then suddenly we're putting our feet into dorsiflexion and we're training everyone in a lengthened range. So, well, hang on. That paper just came out today. Read the limitations, understand where it fits into the big picture. And yes, you might spend a block of time emphasizing lengthened range, but don't just change everything because something new came out in a study or you just saw something on social media.
Yeah. And the point you brought up there about having a system or having a process is kind of my first point that I wanted to dive into. Um, and I really want to make this discussion around the practical applications of program design, periodization, all that fun stuff for PTs and coaches who might be new to the game or don't really have a depth of understanding around those things. So when we're talking about like program design, periodization 101, in your eyes, what are the most fundamental things that coaches need to understand from a like periodization standpoint, and then how we apply that in practice to program design based on experience levels and different individuals?
It's worth understanding what these two terms are and what they aren't, because there is confusion and there's a little controversy, and it often stems from the two terms, periodization and programming, being thought of as the same construct. A lot of our understanding comes from training theories that have been developed for over the last 100 years,
Yeah.
but primarily in the world of sports, where they're looking at attributes of strength, whether that's maximal strength or speed strength or power. These are often neurologically driven. They adapt very quickly, and therefore variation in the training process, called periodization, has to be done with thoughtfulness, logic, and speed so that you don't overtrain or you don't miss the boat.
Yeah.
So when we talk about periodization, a lot of our understanding comes from the Soviet Union and America in particular, that is looking at a very specific outcome for sports. Muscle hypertrophy, or in our world, if we're not working with athletes at Olympic level, we're looking at changing the cross-sectional surface area of muscle. Now, this takes a lot longer, which means that if we're reading the training theories, they need to be modified to have an emphasis on muscle mass and not a quality of strength like maximal strength, power, speed, so forth.
Yeah.
And it would be foolish just to say, well, that's all for sport. and it has nothing to do with hypertrophy and body composition. So I'm just going to ignore it all and train specifically all year round. If there's something that sporting theories have told us, it's that you do need consistency, but you have to have variation so that the body is presented with fresh stimulus. Otherwise, we stagnate and we go stale, and training becomes too monotonous.
Yep.
And this couldn't be more true when you look at, say, physique competitors who would train perhaps in the 8 to 12 rep range, train very similar movement patterns, very similar volumes all year round, and therefore have to resort to PEDs to get that next level because they've just stopped growing, rather than exploring the wide range of different options. So periodization is just simply the big picture. How do we have planned, logical variation to pick, to optimize performance, and to avoid overtraining? That's the big picture. Then programming drives the day-to-day. It's the sets, the reps, the exercise choice, the exercise order, whether you choose overload techniques and so forth, and how often you stay on that program. They will be subservient to what that block of training's goal is, whether it's to develop strength or to bring up weak links and build work capacity, or just focus on volume and drive that muscle protein synthesis. So they're the two different aspects that a coach is always thinking. What's big picture? Where do we sit in the big picture? And what is the day-to-day?
Yeah. And yeah, that sort of process, and this was kind of the point that I was alluding to, was getting out of the mindset of like, this is a program for like 8 to 12 weeks and that's it. It's how you logically think about, I might have this client for the next 12 months, 2 years, 3 years. How can I provide a system or a framework that, continually adapts over time to express a different result? Now, I know there was a paper that came out maybe last year or something like that, and it was looking at different periodization strategies and whether there was actually any benefit to periodizing or not periodizing. And this is a point that Dr. D'Souza and I discussed about how you interpret that research, and it was basically like there was no difference between periodizing and not periodizing, and I think a lot of people take that as like, periodization doesn't matter, so who cares? I'm just not going to do it. But on the flip side of that is like, well, it performed no better or no worse, so maybe we should do it as well.
Yeah, this is where caution has to be undertaken. When we have 100 years of training theories that have either been observational to observe what the best athletes have done, or it's either been interventional and short duration in terms of a study, for a study to come out to say, well, hey, there's no real difference whether you keep things similarly or whether you follow a strategy of planned variation. Well, what was the duration, and what was the training outcome, and what was the level of experience? If the subject base is of low training experience, then yes, you would argue that you probably wouldn't need to have too much planned variation because you're so far away from your genetic ceiling.
Yes.
Yes, you would be mindful to not do too much too soon. Would you benefit from a really good, thoughtful planning of progression from do this, master it, move on to the next pay grade, so to speak, and so forth? I thought, well, yeah, any coach would do that.
Yeah.
I get a little cautious when I see an 8 to 12 week study on a university population group, when I see methods being used that any coach who's been around for a number of years just wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And this isn't to put down research. It's really hard to get ethics approval. It's really hard to do a design and get it done. So nobody should ever be belittling research, but we just need to look at it in the context of what it's done and what it can actually teach us. And that these studies are at odds with the vast majority of data on periodization, that it's better to say, whether you're using a sequential block method or whether you're using an undulating approach, it doesn't really seem to matter which method of variation you're using. But the fact that when you compare that to unvaried training, varied training gives you better results. Now, that data is clear and uncontroversial. But yeah, I'm very cautious of that kind of research in its applicability to what we do day to day.
Yeah. And I mean, you can't argue, like you said, with the hundreds of years of, empirical evidence or evidence in itself, really, that approach works. And obviously, working with world-class coaches and speaking to people of that generation, it's like you can't argue with the results they got as well using a periodized approach.
Yeah, it's a very low level viewpoint that is usually more data driven. That is, sports science graduates think, oh, I'm going to reanalyze this 100 years of literature
Mm.
and I'm going to prove it all wrong because they took drugs or because it was observational. So, right, they were doing what they were doing in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. They analyzed performance with the best techniques that they had at the time. But to come and think that you've discovered something that 100 years of the greatest brains in coaching and science had worked out, it smacks more of arrogance and self-importance rather than trying to find the best results for clients.
Yeah. So when we're looking at that then, and you kind of alluded to that fact about different strategies that you can use for plan variation. For someone out there who doesn't understand what those different like options are, could you walk us through, I guess, the main periodizational strategies that you would use or that you would see in practice, and where they apply to potentially beginner, intermediate, advanced trainees?
Right. Periodization is a really broad topic. And it is also very confusing because many of the models that plan variation are doing so with a very specific sporting outcome. And often when you take that and then apply it in another setting, it might not work as well. So the first thing to understand is, why are you doing what you're doing and what are you trying to improve?
Yeah.
And in that case, we've essentially got two different models, broadly speaking, but within the two different models, there's a number of different variations that can be used with great success depending on what your outcome is. Because we're not dealing with agility or reaction time or speed strength sports, we can happily disregard a number of models because they're just not going to apply to us.
So,
What we're more interested in is longer lasting training effects and residual training effects and long-term athletic development protocols. This is where models like a block sequential approach to training probably gives us greater variation, and undulating periodization models.
yeah.
And what the difference between those two are is that a block sequential model or a conjugated model would say, we want to produce hypertrophy. And what do we need to perform 6 months of hypertrophy training? That relies on a degree of muscle symmetry between left to right and prime mover to stabilizer. It requires work capacity to handle training volumes, to recover set to set without dropping volume load, and to recover session to session so that you can accomplish weeks of training at the best capacity. It requires a degree of strength because strength underpins the ability to create mechanical tension when you're training for volume.
Oh.
So a sequential block model would say, well, let's start with 6 weeks of developing work capacity, building left to right prime mover to stabilizer balance. And then let's focus on the development of strength. And then let's start to build volume with a number of different methods. And that would be done with, so each program builds on the capacities that we developed in the previous program. Now, an undulating approach might say, let's develop all of these together.
Mm-hmm.
Let's focus on the development of work capacity on one day, stability, left to right balance on another day, and strength and hypertrophy on other days. And we can put those within the week and we can plan variation over time. This is where the daily undulating periodization model came from, is born in the roots of athletes who needed to do tennis on Monday and they needed to compete on the weekend, but they had a lot of tactical training, which means that they would turn up to training fatigued. And this flexible approach would say, well, you need strength, power, hypertrophy, strength, endurance. So let's plan that within a training week. And if you're performing poorly, we can swap that out and do some high rep work here and so forth. And these are basically the two approaches that I would use when working with a physique competitor or a body composition competitor, because that gives me flexibility.
Yep.
But the block model allows me to plan increases in training volume built on very well-known capacities that we can develop in time.
Yeah, unreal. So if we want to sort of dive a little bit deeper into those two strategies, if we're looking at that block model first, what population potentially does that apply to? Is it more a beginner intermediate thing? Is it more advanced? And then secondarily, what does that look like specifically if we were to plan out, let's say, a 12-week training cycle? What does that look like? You know, if it was 3-4 week mesocycles, how do we look at that fundamentally?
Yeah, well, let's look at the beginner first. And your programming goal or the overriding goal of that next phase of training is always um, individualized based on the client. So if they are essentially a beginner and want to improve body composition, clearly the first 6 months is going to be about mastering technique, mastering range of motion, bringing up weak links,
Yep.
stabilizers, front to back, left to right. And that wouldn't require anything other than a linear approach to periodization. And that is, we're going to start with a lot of exercise variation, low set number, so low volume, and high reps.
Yep.
And in time, we're going to focus less on the weak links and the stabilizers and more on multi-joint, teaching left and right to work together, the arms to work with the trunk, to work with the so forth. And that's a classic Matveyev approach developed in the 50s and 60s of start with very high reps or low intensity and then work in time.
Yep.
I find that that works really well once, and that's typically for the first year of a client's training,
Mm-hmm.
focusing on building work capacity, left to right balance, front to back, technique mastery, range of motion, control, so forth.
Yep.
When a client passes year one, so we call them intermediate, this is where I'd probably enter a more undulating approach to training. So we need more variation in the loading schemes. And this is where either every 2 to 4 weeks, we might wildly change the loading parameters. And that could be starting the first program at 20 RM and then dropping down to an 8 RM and then back up to a 15. And so we're waiving the intensity. And this, again, works really well, probably once or twice. So I tend to use it when a client is an intermediate level.
Yep.
And the reason why I'm putting it here and not elsewhere is that we've got really good advanced methods.
Yes.
And as a client becomes more well-trained, you need to be more inventive with the progressive overload, how much volume they can handle, how much they need to recover. And that's where models like block and conjugate methods work so much better. I wouldn't pull out the big guns for an intermediate lifter. So I think an undulating approach would work just fine. You would introduce basic overload techniques to increase variety and overload. And then once a client has passed 2 or 3 years, that's when we need to be far more considerate of their approaching genetic ceiling. And we now need to be much more careful with our planning of variation.
And when we're looking at those approaches, are we, I guess in terms of volume, that's probably my question. Are we planning volume according to the outcome? Are we planning volume according to the person? So maybe lower volume for a beginner, or as we get more advanced, we sort of increase volume. Like how are you looking at that?
Well, a beginner doesn't need a lot of volume to turn on muscle protein synthesis. And when you look at the data, a beginner doesn't really have the machinery to grow muscle in the first, let's say, 12 weeks.
Yeah.
Yes, you will get stronger because most of the adaptations from the weights room are neurological. You're recruiting more muscle mass, you're turning off more antagonists, your brain is organizing how to recruit fibers and how to perform a movement. And studies, the good studies that measure this with high degree of fidelity, show that typically 10 to 12 weeks, your adaptations are neurological and they're not muscular. In other words, when you train, you break down more muscle proteins than you can synthesize. So we actually don't really grow. So we don't really need advanced training methods at that point. So if you're pulling out supersets and drop sets, not necessary. You just need to focus on technique mastery, skill development, build work capacity.
Sure.
And plugging up some weak links. After that point, this is where volume becomes more important. And yes, volume is always dependent on your training age, how well you recuperate, potentially your fiber typing, because fast twitch, at least with the endurance studies, show that you don't recover as well. And if you're very slow twitch, then you could probably recover within 24 hours. So there's a lot of things that gets thrown into the conversation when you are working with a well-trained individual as to how much volume can you tolerate. And if in our industry, we view it as more is better, and potentially that's not the case at all.
Yeah. And I see this so often, especially going into commercial gyms like we were chatting about before. The sort of newbie lifter comes into the gym, maybe following like their favorite, bodybuilder influencer off Instagram. And hey, that guy does 30 sets of biceps a week. I'm trying to grow my biceps and they've just started training and their technique sucks. Their execution isn't on point. They're not recruiting muscle fibers like they should. And they end up wondering why, like, hey, why am I not progressing? What am I missing here? Which, that approach is very backwards, I think.
Very backwards. Typically, less is more, because what are you trying to do? You're trying to stimulate a muscle protein synthesis pathway.
Yeah.
And when you look at the position stance or you look at the volume studies and try and draw conclusions that we're going to apply to our clients, is that we are triggering muscle synthesis via mechanical tension primarily, and then repeating the muscle to that several times, several sets, several exercises that then turn on the muscles to grow. But ultimately, it's not a linear pathway. In other words, you'll get most of your bang for your buck in turning on synthesis from the first set. And that's really clear from studies that have looked at one set versus several sets. You go like this, and then you get a little bit more as the sets go on.
Yeah.
At some point, an additional set will cause a residual overtraining phenomena, which means that you'll cause more muscle protein breakdown or more neuromuscular fatigue that you can't wash out by the next session. So you're still on the downward swing before it goes upwards. And this is why typically less is better, and why the majority of studies show that you are reaching your peak of muscle mass growth somewhere between 10 to 20 sets, give or take.
Yeah.
And position stance say you can grow on less than 10 sets a week. And some studies have shown that you can go more than 20 sets, but that's probably the sweet spot, which is remarkable because every day in the gym, I would see both males and females doing more than 20 sets per session. Absolutely. Several times a week. So on what planet is muscle being stimulated with, let's say, call it 30 sets, and then 48 hours again, you train that same muscle. And sometimes it's 24 hours. You see the next day they come back and train again. Now, this is the classic, I'm just going to follow what I've seen on social media rather than, well, what does sports science teach us about the stimulus, recovery, and then the next session again?
And it's the typical, like, someone who does exactly that, and then maybe they get a coach or they have some understanding now as they expand their knowledge. They do less and they think, oh my God, I'm actually growing now. It's working. Low training, low volume is the way to go. And it's like, well, no, you were just doing way too much. It was just not practical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So I love that. In terms of, okay, so the main things that I want to look at then, probably diving to a couple of points here. When we're looking at specific training outcomes, and I know obviously, talking with you over the years and doing a number of your courses and seminars and things like that, when we're looking at different training outcomes, so like strength, hypertrophy, fat loss, I think is a really important one. What are the main differences or the main approaches that you would utilize to achieve, let's say, strength, fat loss, hypertrophy, and how do they fit into the bigger picture of programming?
There are different qualities, different outcomes. If the quality of strength that you're trying to improve is maximal strength, then we know that there are two approaches that have to be conducted within a session by and large. You need exercises that can handle maximal load. So by far and away, we're looking at compound barbell-based movements.
Yep.
This then teaches the nervous system to recruit the most amount of motor units or fast twitch muscle fibers. We need sufficient recovery between sets, but we also need the loads to be such that you're approaching your capacity or approaching your 1RM, which means that we've got 100 years of experiment and studies that essentially say the anatomy of a workout would be 1 to 2 bang for your buck multi-joint movements that can handle loads under 5 RM, so 1 to 5 RM or thereabouts, with 2 to 3 minutes of rest with multiple sets. That after that point, the neurological system would be fried if you kept doing more and more work like that. Yep. And that's where accessory movements or auxiliary movements come in. And that is, they are movements done with lighter loads or repetitive effort methods, not maximal effort methods, that either train the movement pattern, the muscles, or the contraction velocity, or you name it, whatever's involved in those primary movements. That's what the accessory movements take care of. Yep. And that could be looking after your quads and glutes and back, or your grip and your rotator cuff, But that's where 3 or 4 other exercises done with higher repetitions or lower RMs would be used. Then you would plan sufficient recovery so that next time you came to the gym, you could handle that again. And that's where the finesse of coaching comes in. Most people don't train the deadlift more than once a week, but
Sure.
the squat you might be able to train once or twice a week. Some people find that they need more variation. They train the deadlift every 2 weeks because it's so neurologically taxing. And that's where the finesse of coaching says you recover well, you don't recover well. So we can sort that out in time to find out what kind of athlete you are.
Yeah.
When training for body composition, then you've really got two twin themes. And that is, I want to preserve muscle mass while I'm in energy deficit because the body doesn't particularly want to grow muscle in energy deficit. Muscle
Sure.
protein synthesis is dampened when you are in energy deficit. So we run this fine tightrope of trying to keep getting gains in muscle, but not pushing you into overtraining because the food is not there to support recovery.
Yeah.
And that's where we have a number of different philosophies of cycling calories, cycling program volumes and intensities to avoid the all too common overtraining and inducing relative energy deficiency in sport, which are these low energy syndromes that go on when you've dieted too long, too hard, without variation.
Yeah.
So the twin themes are expend energy, hang on to muscle. And I think everyone agrees that for body composition, we put the premium time on resistance training and we focus that with energy deficit or cycling energy. And then aerobic training is used to support at a lower grade
Yeah.
the energy expenditure side of the equation when we're looking at energy balance.
Yeah. And I know that you're a big proponent of this, the energy cycling with fat loss phases. So could you give us a little bit more context in terms of what you mean? Because I think a lot of people maybe get confused by like carb cycling or calorie cycling, that it has some magic benefit. What are
Mm.
you typically using it for, and how's that applied to, I guess, the way you would do things?
My thought process came about from looking at the studies done in the late 80s and early 90s, primarily on gymnasts and track and field marathon runners, that showed that when you exercised and dieted, so you're in low energy availability, then the body has inbuilt evolutionary mechanisms that begin to compress. They shut down. So your energy expenditure from training reduces, your energy expenditure at rest reduces, and a whole host of other adaptive responses to being in low energy. The way these studies also show that when you return back to energy balance, you would these systems would go back to normal, providing that you weren't in them for very long periods of time. So that was my first concept of, well, perhaps we shouldn't be in energy deficit for marked periods of time. Fast forward 30, 40 years, is that there have now been a number of studies that have looked at the periodization of energy and have generally shown not too much benefit. But when you look at the limitations of the data, the amount of weight loss that they have over the period of the study duration, it's often really modest.
Yeah.
Often what they're getting in 12 weeks is what we might get in 6 weeks. So again, this is not to criticize research, but it's, well, what methods did you use to get that outcome? Because we're not using those methods. We're using far more aggressive. In other words, we would not be happy with a 3 kilogram weight loss in 12 weeks.
No.
We do that in a few weeks. So
Yeah.
automatically, we can't take that finding and say there's no difference and then apply it to us. So I've found there has been great success. And when I say great success, I am looking at a DEXA scan so I can measure with really high fidelity your muscle mass and your fat mass and
Yeah.
your bone mass while looking at blood metrics of the important markers, reproductive hormones, androgens, thyroid hormones. And we can compare those to people who just diet long term, which is not what my approach, but we can get that data, versus the energy cycling. It's also, and I'm trying to get cross-pollination from different disciplines, the whole relative energy deficiency in sports literature is now vast and shows that when you are at a certain level of energy restriction, the body then kicks in these adaptive responses.
Yeah.
When we return carbohydrate or when we return energy, then you basically abolish those adaptive responses. So whether you return to balance 1 day a week, 2 days a week, or whether you insert carbohydrate feedings around quality sessions, this whole energy and calorie cycling, they're all part and parcel of trying to get around the adaptive response
Yeah.
the body doesn't squash those systems, but to also make sure that we're not blunting muscle protein synthesis.
Okay. So, and I guess this is kind of around the whole refeed versus diet break and how you implement those, how often you implement them, and where that fits into the bigger picture of, say, a contest prep over, 12, 16, 20, 24 weeks. Because I think fundamentally it does slow down potentially the rate of progress, but whether or not that trade-off is worth the saving of, the client throughout that process.
That's right. I'm always looking at client athletes' health first and foremost. And I have been shocked at the number of coaches who've said to me, yes, my clients have lost their menstrual cycle, but that's okay. That's not okay.
Mm.
At any time, just to look good on a certain day, that is not, so that's not my approach. It's always athletes' health first rather than outcomes. But I can say with a degree of happiness that every female that I have worked with at the very highest level, 5 pro wins in 5 attempts in the last year and a half, none of the girls lost their menstrual cycle. And it shows it can be done, but you need to plan that into the period. So if you're ordinarily dieting for 16 weeks, then we might start at 21 weeks or longer to plan the diet breaks in there. And I actually don't use a diet break. I just use refeeds.
Yeah.
And I just don't think a diet break offers me any advantage than periodically inserting carbohydrate refeeds and return to energy balance.
Yeah. Okay. So the single day refeed, multi-day refeed throughout the week,
Yeah.
based around those sessions.
Yeah, and it's individualized, whether we do it on the hardest training days to make sure that they're well fueled and can get more out of it, or whether the client prefers to do it on a Saturday, Sunday when they're resting,
Yeah.
and they can really restock their muscle glycogen ready for Monday legs again.
That's a good point too, because I feel like a lot of people are really either in one camp or the other when it comes to refeeds, single day or multi-day, whether or not, hey, you should do it on your rest day because that's when you've got the extra building blocks, to kind of recover better, or should you have that extra available energy on the hardest training days to be able to train harder? Like, where do you fall on that sort of situation?
You trial it, you measure, you take certain indices that are going to provide feedback, and that's typically your volume load and mood status.
Yeah.
And if Sunday is a refeed day and you're trying to eat 8 grams per kilogram of body mass and carbohydrate in preparation for what you're going to do on Monday, measure the volume load or do that on the day. But essentially, my view is strongly informed by sports nutrition and endurance world, where they have thrown countless dollars into research. And yes, it's a different outcome, but it's still training.
Yeah.
And this idea of having a red light, orange light, green light for the energy status or carbohydrate status, which has been used very successfully in endurance cycling, I have applied directly to the physique world with tremendous success. But that pre-meal can either be the day before, but it can also be the night before and then the morning of. So there's a lot of ways that you can play with it, but just measure an outcome. What do you want? What is the whole training outcome predicated on? Well, it's your volume load.
Yeah.
So if your volume load is better because you refed the day before and then you went into it, fantastic. You found what works for that individual.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, it's basically individualized based on the outcome you want to see with that client for their specific goal.
Well, a lot of clients are very robotic, and that is, you just tell me what to do and I'm doing it. And others, they need a carrot, and that carrot is, I will be in energy deficit. I'll have 17 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass for energy availability Monday through Friday, but Saturday, Sunday, I want 35. So I want to eat 1,800 Monday to Friday, regardless of what I do, but then I'm going to have 2,500 on Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah.
Great, that's a carrot, and they look forward to it. And others are, give me the best outcome. That is, I'm going to have 2 grams per kilogram of body mass carbohydrate Monday morning before I train. Work it out. That's what good coaches do. They do not have one approach for every athlete.
Yeah, it's such a good point to bring up, and something that obviously as a coach makes sense to be able to track that data, and even obviously something that we both do, looking at calories per kilogram of body weight, and making sure that's adequate throughout the entire dieting phase, but also having those periods of refeed where you can hopefully combat the metabolic adaptation that does occur.
Exactly. So I use calories per kilogram of fat-free mass because all the athletes have DEXA.
Sure, cool. Now, I mean, you mentioned the five pro wins, the Olympic athletes and people that you've coached from all sort of walks of life and sports. When we're looking at the really high level athletic population versus the general population, like I'm sure you work with as well on the day to day, what are the main differences? What are the main similarities? And then in terms of the way you approach each of those, how do they kind of fall into the bigger picture of program design for you?
Typically, every client who comes to me or comes to us, they are highly motivated. The difference is what is their training outcome, whether it is more professional, competition oriented, or whether they just want to be fit and healthy and improve body composition.
Yeah.
That's by and large the big difference. Now, within that is the capacity to train and recover, but also the desire to train. And for those people who are the general public, they may love training and can train multiple times a day, but don't particularly care about improving a bench press or a particular muscle to its maximum. I'm one of these people. I just like training, so I just train.
Yeah.
Full stop. And that's something that I'll do morning and night and around meals to improve glucose control. But there's no outcome other than just want to be fit and healthy. Now, a client might say at a physique competitor, I want to look good on this date because I want to win, versus other people who just like to look good.
Mhm.
And within that is how much training do you do? Because how much training do you need to do versus how much you just like to do?
Yeah.
And this is all part of the initial questionnaire of, well, what do you really want to achieve? And from there, then you can design the short-term, long-term training program based on how much time they can give you and what their end goal is.
Yeah. Okay. So really a lot of it is down to, willingness to train, what they actually want to achieve at that end point. And I think whether or not someone's really advanced, maybe they need lots more volume, which requires
Yeah,
lots more training.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then potentially more advanced strategies in terms of how you set that up.
correct. And that will just fit in where they are in their athletic development. For beginners, I never use overload techniques. For well-trained, I almost always use overload techniques. And then there's everyone in between.
Yeah. Okay. So that's actually a good point. It brings me into my next question. When we're talking about overload techniques, just for like general, information, what are we talking about specifically?
One of the generalized theories of training tell us that to get a training outcome, to grow muscle, to get stronger, to get faster, you need progressive overload. In other words, you need to do more this week than you did last week. And
Yep.
within that, there's a number of ways of doing it. You can add another session, you can add a longer session, you can add more exercises, more sets, less recovery, you name it. There's so many ways that you can progress a client in terms of their ability to handle and tolerate a workload.
Yep.
Within that comes a method or methods, which we call overload techniques. And they are one way of many in our toolbox of increasing the amount of work a client does.
Yep.
And the overloads, broadly speaking, would fit under four categories, of which in each category, broadly speaking, you could have a number of different variations. You can add more volume per unit of time. That's where a superset, a triset, a drop set, it all works. It all makes one muscle do more work in a period of time. So they are volume methods or set extension methods.
Yep.
Then we have range of motion modifiers. And this is where the 21s technique or a 1 1/4 or a partial range, these are all changing the way a muscle is spending time in a specific position. Like a 1 1/4, you spend more time, quarter, than full in the hardest or the more lengthened range.
Yep.
Then we've got contraction modifiers where we either spend time eccentrically or we super maximally load an eccentric or we do pauses and we
Yep.
do a hold. And so when we look at set extensions, range of motion modifiers, contraction modifiers, and then we've got the fourth, which are essentially neurological tricks or primers for the neurological system. And this is all come from the strength power world, where if you do a set that's submaximal, what you'll do in the next 2, 3 minutes, you'll be able to do more. And this is called priming
Yep.
or post-activation potentiation. And this is where complexes come from. And that's the bread and butter of strength power sports. We use wave loading, cluster sets, rest pause methods. They are all priming methods. And we draw upon these because one, they give us progressive overload. two, clients do find them interesting. And so you get more buy-in, because if you're just doing the same straight sets from program to program, the client goes, right, that's a little bit boring.
Yeah.
I just read a story this morning of the Tour de France champion who won this year. He's won 3 of them, but he changed his coach at the beginning of this year, who he's had years of success with. And when interviewed, he said, why? He said, well, training was just becoming the same old. So I needed fresh input, fresh ideas, different methods.
Yeah.
And that is a really important lesson, is that you can make an argument that you don't need as much variation as perhaps I would give them, but clients love it. So they buy into it more rather than more monotonous training forms. So that's essentially why we do it. And to me, I can plan volume increases and decreases in volume by depending which overload technique that I choose.
Yeah. Okay. So when we're looking at that sort of long-term periodization from beginner, intermediate, advanced, we're kind of getting away from the boring stuff. We'll call it the straight sets, the, you know, the things that you need to do in order to be able to handle the more advanced method later on. When we're looking at actual program setup, so if we're talking like physique competitor specifically, because that's kind of the world that we're both in, when does it make sense to utilize, like, I guess, different strategies or different phases of training? And does it make sense to have a physique competitor, say, do a strength block and then more of a, you know, traditional hypertrophy block, maybe more advanced training techniques? How does that fit into the picture of programming for that physique athlete?
In the late 1970s, early 80s, a Russian by the name of Yuri Verkhoshansky said that you should perform training in sequential conjugated, which means joined together blocks. And then in the 80s, a German researcher called Dietmar Schmidtbleicher basically proposed, based on that theory, you should perform a hypertrophy block, 3-4 weeks, then a strength block, then a hypertrophy, then a strength.
Yeah.
And Charles Poliquin took that idea from Schmidtbleicher and published an amazing article in 1986, talking about if your goal is to improve muscle mass, you should vary these qualities program to program. And Poliquin had that at 3 weeks each, 3 weeks through strength, hypertrophy. When you look at that idea, that's a sequential manipulation of the training variables to insert variation so that the muscle and the brain is never presented with the same kind of stimulus, planning variation every 3-4 weeks.
Yeah.
In time, these viewpoints have been studied. And just 2 years ago, a study looked at giving individuals 8 straight weeks of hypertrophy training, or 3 weeks of strength and then 5 weeks of hypertrophy. But they did the same hypertrophy program. The group that did strength first, followed by hypertrophy, compared to hypertrophy, had greater gains, obviously, in strength, but in muscle mass as well.
Yeah.
And this is modern day evidence of what Verkhoshansky had shown 40 years ago, is that if your goal is muscle mass, what do you need to do volume work successfully? And his argument was, you need a foundation of strength.
Yeah.
I think we can work within the spirit of that and say that hypertrophy, you do need volume. So a 1-to-1 ratio to me doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I would construct a block of high intensity training, which would be maximal strength development, which then would prime the muscle groups that I'd want to grow to handle more mechanical tension in the next block, which would now be more volume and no more maximal strength, which would then lead you to launch pad a third phase of training, which would be the highest volume that you could absorb and tolerate and positively adapt to, followed by rest. And that would be a block. And that would plan variation. It would allow me to use 3 different overload techniques, maybe a cluster set, a superset, and a drop set. And then I would plan recovery. And then that process would start again, but with harder overload techniques and more training volume.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what, I mean, for people listening out there who maybe don't understand like the Poliquin method or that approach to training that was kind of proposed, we're talking those sort of intensification, accumulation phases stacked on top of each other over the course of, say, a training year, basically.
Now that is really interesting because Charles and Schmidtbleicher, they are dealing at that time with strength athletes. Now that would make sense.
Yeah.
It is very clear that cross-sectional surface area is responsible for at least 60% of force production, at least. So bigger athletes, stronger athletes lift more load.
Yes.
So you would do a hypertrophy followed by strength, hypertrophy followed by, and if that is your goal of developing a stronger athlete, that would make sense. But
Absolutely.
it does not make sense if your goal is to grow muscle, because you require the neurological changes to get stronger happen very rapidly. The architectural changes that drive your muscle mass take a really long time. So it
Mm.
doesn't make sense to order it that way, nor to spend such fewer time in volume. So it does need modification.
Yeah. Okay. So when we're thinking about this, and this is how, I mean, I was competing in powerlifting at national level. I had guys competing national level and above, and that's how we would typically set up their powerlifting programs. Would be like a really really base level hypertrophy plan
Mhm.
to kind of build up some muscle tissue that you maybe lost over the course of those heavy
Mhm.
training cycles that were low in volume. Gives
Mhm.
you a break, gives you some variation with maybe moving from a low bar squat to like a safety bar squat.
Mhm.
And then as you progressed throughout that program, it would go more into sort of general strength and then specific strength, where if we're talking the physique athlete, we're almost talking about it in reverse. You
In
want to
reverse,
have,
correct. Yep.
yeah, that strength phase
Yep.
initially to, and I think to kind of give this some more context, the strength phase first allows you to express more high threshold motor units that have the potential to build down the line, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we're basically allowing more mechanical machinery to kind of happen to express more hypertrophy as we progress throughout that program.
Correct. And this was first utilized with both Charlie Francis as a track coach and Gennady Turetsky in the pool. They would use this reverse model, which had been everything as we've discussed before. You'd start high repetitions and you'd work down to strength over time. What these two coaches in the 80s did is the other way around. They started with maximal work
Yeah,
and then built work capacity over time. That's essentially what we're saying here, is that you will develop strength for the reasons you've just said, more motor units, greater level of strength, great ability to tap into high threshold motor units, fast twitch fibers of the muscles you want to grow, and then expose those muscles to greater volume for at least 2 or 3 programs before you would need recovery. And that is individualized based on metrics of mood, your progress, your heart rate variability, your libido, on and on. These are things that you're trying to put into the observation and monitoring of your athlete.
yeah, okay. And when we're looking at, I guess, to kind of dive in a little bit deeper into just that hypertrophy situation, obviously the body of literature at the moment kind of states that hypertrophy rep range is anywhere between like 5 and 30, and the volume targets 10 to 20 sets per week. When we're utilizing those different strategies, so say for example we're in that intensification phase early on, the heavier loads would potentially dictate less volume needed for that phase, and then progressing that volume as we go on.
Correct. So that's all part of the plan. What
Yep.
is your goal in the first 3 to 4 weeks? It's not to accumulate volume.
Yep.
It's to develop maximal strength in the movements you want to develop later on with volume. That's your only goal.
Yep.
You can develop strength with very low volume, and that's the volume is de-emphasized.
Yep.
And then we add, I would call it a moderate volume phase,
Mhm.
again, individualized on how much a client can tolerate, frequency, session volume, and weekly volume.
Yep.
And I would use a very basic overload technique to that end, because I'd probably use straight sets in program 1, which means I wouldn't use the same method again.
Yep.
To me, a straight set is just a tool and a launch pad to add an overload technique. And from that point, I would then measure the volume load and make sure in the third program, the volume had gone up again. If a client was a super responder, I might do a third volume block, even more volume again. If you're still responding, why change the method? But for most people, they would need a program change. And that now you've planned a volume intensity that has gone upwards, then we recover back to intensity, and then we get build it again. So the waves are constantly going like this over a 6 month or 12-month period.
Okay. And then to touch on that point a little bit more, then, if you were to use, let's say, for example, if we were doing hack squat, for example, in our first phase in that strength block, would you typically change the exercise, or would you simply add an overload technique as you progress throughout the volume phases, um, mainly to kind of get around that learning period? So, say for example, if you did 3 to 4 weeks of hack squat, and then you went, "Hey, we're going to do Smith machine squat now."
Mm.
Would there be a case to kind of keep it, or would you simply vary the exercise, or just add the overload technique to the initial exercise?
I've done both. The overall thought process is that the exercise choice number one has to be maximal strength, but has to be the muscle group you want to hypertrophy.
Yeah.
From that point on, as I'm bringing overload techniques, I'm no longer dependent on load. I'm
Yeah.
depending on muscle recruitment. So it's actually the opposite of what you'd see in sports, where you would start general and you'd move specific. We start very specifically in terms of the multi-joint bang for your buck movement, squat, deadlift,
Yeah.
trap bar. But then in the third program, for a physique competitor, it could very be driven towards an isolated hip thrust, a reverse hyper,
Gotcha.
something that you're getting rid of the brain trying to use the stabilizers and the whole balance mechanisms. We just want the muscle. So
Mhm.
we really go very everything to very targeted over those three programs.
Yeah, which is a great point as well, for especially for physique athletes. If you think about, the closer you are to that show, the
Mhm.
more fatigue you have accumulated over
Mhm.
that period. It makes no sense to be trying to do, 5 rep max deadlifts 2 weeks out from your comp. You're just going to get injured.
No. So what we want to do is have a thought process that is, we don't want to overuse good exercises. It's clear for a physique competitor, these isolated movements are bang for your buck. We want to save them for when your body is primed to get the most out of them.
Yeah.
In other words, I don't want to use it all year round. So I'm going to save those really targeted movements when I'm fine tuning an athlete. And I'll use greater variation earlier on in the training and build them towards that over time.
Yeah, love it. Okay. The probably one of the last points that I did want to bring up with regard to physique athletes in particular is the use of cardiovascular training and the importance of cardiovascular fitness. And I know for me personally, dealing with you over the many years, and for anyone who hasn't done any of Tony's training camps or workshops that we did back in the days, doing some of those, I think we did the hill sprints when you had the gym over in the Northern Beaches. Um, where does that fall into the program design structure of a physique athlete? So the importance of number one, cardiovascular fitness, and number two, the application. So sort of hit versus listen and the drawbacks and positives of each.
When we begin with the end in mind, what do we want an athlete to be able to accomplish over a build or in a prep? It's to handle as much volume as possible before it pushes over training.
Yeah.
If the way that we're monitoring this is via volume load, the issue for most individuals is they're not fit enough to tolerate the workloads required.
Yeah.
And there are a number of ways that you can raise work capacity. That's beyond dispute. But what's the most effective way that gives us multiple benefits? And when we talk about tolerating workloads, we mean not just your cardiovascular fitness, but we also mean how efficient your body is at buffering your acid, how quickly that can return back to normal levels between sets, how that accumulates over a training session. So when you see clients lying on the floor between sets, you know that next set it's not going to be done proficiently.
Yeah.
That's just a sign that your acid buffering system is not where it needs to be, nor is your cardiovascular fitness.
Yeah.
We often view cardio as it's an energy expender, so we want to do it to expend energy. And I don't view it that way at all, because it's not really amazing at doing that.
No.
It's really amazing at working at tolerating acid, buffering the lactate, but to also build capillary beds. And we
Mhm.
now have a number of studies that show, and this is within subject design. So one leg can do cardio and the other leg does not, but both legs do weight training.
Yeah.
So that we get a greater response in hypertrophy in the leg that does cardio, directly attributable to your capillary beds. All training builds capillaries,
Yeah.
but cardio is really specific. So if you want to grow quads, then you would focus on building capillaries in your quads via cycling. If it was the glutes, you might do more stepper or rowing, where you're getting more deep hip flexion.
Mhm.
But either way, your cardio and upper body, obviously swimming and rowing, if you want to grow that area, you're building capillary beds and you're teaching the muscle to build a buffering capacity, both in the blood and in the muscle, that enables you to handle more work while working cardiovascular fitness. So to me, I would have a very strong emphasis on modes that built your type 1 fiber, your slow twitch acid buffering capacity in the off season, sprinkled in with HRT, which is working on acid capacity at a different level, at type 2 levels. So we have two different transporters of lactate, fast twitch and slow twitch, MCT1, MCT2,
Yep.
and they're both developed separately and differently. So we build that to the best capacity in the muscles we want to grow. And then in time, as we build volume, that comes down
Yep.
because it does expend energy. And unless you're eating that back, you will be in low energy without realizing it. And then often that's where you hear they interfere with each other. Absolutely. If you don't eat back that energy. But there's nothing in the contraction that interferes. So that's clear in meta-analyses that have looked at this in energy balance.
Yep.
Is that cardio creates energy deficit if you don't watch out for it. So for me, at my weight, I can expend 800 calories an hour doing cardio.
Yep.
So if I don't eat that back, I will not grow, full stop. It's not that the bike riding reduced my gains, it's the low energy.
Sure.
And I just do less and less of that over time because once you've got that capacity, you maintain the capacity. It just takes a while to build it.
So basically what you're saying is kind of more work in the off season, dialing it back as you move into that dieting period because food is coming down and we want to preserve energy in that sense.
Yeah, in the general preparation phase, there's a strong emphasis, maybe 3 or 4 sessions a week on maybe 3 sessions building type 1 fiber acid buffering with type 2 fiber with the interval training, maybe 1 session a week. And then I would do a little bit more interval training because it's lower duration as we approach competition, and then probably dial that back quite a bit when you're in prep.
Gotcha. Okay. So when we're talking about those different modalities of cardio, what are we talking specifically for someone who wants to apply this to their training? So we're talking sort of list sessions, we're talking hit sessions, and then how we implementing those.
Yeah, the list is essentially low intensity steady state is essentially steps. So I would save that for prep work when you get a little bit of energy expenditure, a little bit of active recovery, but it's under the radar for recovery.
Yeah.
Moderate intensity steady state, which in today's language is called zone 2, keeps the heart rate at around 75% of maximum or lactate at around 2 millimolars.
Yeah.
And once we do this, we know it's all contained metabolism in slow twitch fibers, but we know that because lactate production and clearance is kept pace, it's building your MCT1, which is your transporters of lactate into the mitochondria of your slow twitch fibers to be used as a fuel source.
Gotcha.
And that is built robustly in zone 2, which means that we try and accumulate 3 or 4 sessions, 30 minutes up to an hour in zone 2 to build that system so that when you start doing volume training, you've got the machinery in your slow twitch to accept the lactate, which is produced in fast twitch fibers, to be metabolized. Yep. Now, you also can improve MCT2 by doing interval training. And that's where protocols that are very specific. So we don't use protocols that endurance athletes use because they tax recovery too much. Yep. And I think this is important because we often look at, well, what do endurance athletes do? Let's just do that. But they can rest the next day. Our next day is in the gym. And that means I am a fan of micro intervals or short intervals where we might do a block of 4 to 6 minutes of on off, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, 15 on, 15 off, maybe 30, 30, something like that in a block of 6 minutes. And I might do 3 blocks, so 20 or so minutes of work. That on off, every time you stop, your myoglobin, which is your oxygen supplied in the muscle, like hemoglobin, that allows to reassociate with the muscle. So we don't see the most profound changes in recovery demands as you would do if you're doing, say, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, or off classic 4-minute protocol. Yep. They're great if you're an endurance athlete. They're dreadful if you need to then train legs the next day.
And I remember doing, I think it was a Wingate protocol with you many years ago at Fitness First. Yeah. And I was on the floor for about 20 minutes afterwards trying not to throw up.
Yeah, I remember that. So anything that, what are we trying to improve? Cardiovascular outcomes, acid buffering, mitochondrial capacity, and capillary beds. We want all of those. So how can we get that without interfering with recovery? And since that time, there's been a number of studies that have interrogated the difference in recovery response between the different interval protocol. And they either do that by looking at neuromuscular function or measure oxygen saturation, which is a really nice surrogate marker, or just look at heart rate variability.
Yep.
All of these, when you do sprint interval training like a Wingate or a 3 or 4 minute protocol, they excel at improving cardiovascular fitness, but with a penalty. So that's why I tend to favor short interval protocols as opposed to those bread and butter, which I would use with an athlete any day.
Yeah, okay. And I think this is interesting because it flies in the face of what would generally be accepted as, contest prep or physique athlete implementation, where you're doing more cardio, increasing that duration over the course of a contest prep up until the end, where you're super fatigued, you're doing the most cardio, you're eating the least food, and arguably probably bringing the worst physique to the stage that you could.
Yeah, there's no surprise that often when you see people mid-prep, they look the best. And
Mm.
when you look at them on stage, you think, oh, wow, you're flat. You've actually lost muscle.
Mm.
And this is where we view cardio, I think, a little bit backwards. Cardio, yes, it does expend energy, but what is it really doing at a muscular or a central mechanism? So peripheral or central pathways. We're getting adaptation in muscle or in metabolism that helps us lift weights.
Yeah.
So let's use it for that as long as you understand cardio. But I think cardio is really poorly understood in our industry. We just view it as it's an energy expender. So let's do more of it. Well, I think there's a way better way that keeps the athlete fresh, keeps volume load high, protects muscle from being broken down. There's a lot of good in sequencing cardio appropriately.
Yeah. That, you know what, and I think that's probably a really positive note to leave it on. Just the level of detail and the thought process that you go into as well with your coaching practices based on your understanding and the literature that's out there is why you are in the position that you are. And I think, the leader in the fitness education space as well. So to kind of wrap things up there, what cool things are you working on? What things have you got coming up? And where can people find out some more about you and what you've got going on?
Okay, so in reverse, I am on Instagram, just my name, Tony Boutagy. And I am not the greatest on social media because I'm too busy writing programs, just to be completely honest.
Yeah.
And I have a number of courses that I teach personal trainers, various aspects of what we do day to day. And it's a blend of the science that comes out every day, but also its application, at least from my experience, what I have done over the last 30 years. And I've got one for fat loss, one for program design, and one for understanding periodization, especially the general preparation phase, which is called training to train. And I continue to spend 3 days coaching face-to-face, one-on-one in Sydney. And 2 days I work online, reading the research, writing and upgrading lectures and consulting, which I really enjoy the diversity that brings to my week.
Love it. So for anyone out there who hasn't seen any of Tony's work, who hasn't done any of Tony's courses, as someone who's done lots of them over the years, probably the last 10 years, I can't sort of recommend it enough to anyone to go check out. So Tony, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope everyone gets lots of value from that to be able to take their own training to the next level.
Yeah. Thanks, Carl. Great conversation.
Appreciate it.